March 1945. German defensive positions, eastern bank of the Rhine. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Steinberg had stood watch over the Rhine for 43 days. Each morning he climbed to his observation post in the shattered church tower at Wesel and scanned the western bank through binoculars that never quite stopped shaking in the cold. Each evening he recorded the same conclusion in his field notebook. The Americans gather, but the Rhine remains. Below him, the river ran dark and wide, 400 meters of fast, cold water that had protected Germanic peoples since before written history. Steinberg wasn't alone in his faith. Every German soldier along the eastern bank, from the North Sea to Switzerland, believed the same iron certainty. This river could not be forced. "They'll need bridges," Feldwebel Otto Kraus said one evening, sharing a cigarette in the observation post. "Bridges we can see. Bridges we can destroy." Steinberg nodded. Wehrmacht doctrine was explicit. River crossings required days of vulnerable engineering work, predictable concentration points, and exposed boat shuttles that 88-meter guns could methodically eliminate. The mathematics were simple. Attackers needed 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads, time enough for German artillery to exact a terrible price. The Rhine had always demanded that price. "The Romans built their empire to this river and stopped," Kraus continued, exhaling smoke into the frozen air. "Caesar himself never forced the Rhine against Germanic resistance. Do you know why?" Steinberg knew. Every defender knew. The history was taught in schools, repeated in briefings, embedded in German identity. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar constructed a timber bridge across the Rhine in 10 days, an engineering marvel that allowed Roman legions to raid Germanic territory. But he withdrew after 18 days and burned the bridge behind him. The Rhine had held. Napoleon Bonaparte had faced the same barrier. The emperor who conquered Europe from Madrid to Moscow never forced the Rhine under fire. He crossed at Kehl in 1796, only after the Austrians abandoned their positions. When German armies defended the river, even Napoleon stopped. In 1918, Allied forces reached the Rhine only after Germany's collapse, entering as occupiers, not conquerors. No army in modern history had conducted a successful opposed crossing of the Rhine against determined defenders. "This river is Germany," Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel told his officers at 15th Army headquarters during a March briefing. Not the government in Berlin, not the party. The Rhine itself, the water, the current, the width. Nature built this fortress. Geography protects what our divisions cannot. The strategic calculus seemed irrefutable. The Rhine stretched over 1,300 kilometers from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. At most crossing points, it ran 300 to 500 meters wide, with currents reaching 6 kilometers per hour in spring flow. Water temperature in March hovered just above freezing. Combat engineers estimated any bridging operation required minimum 36 hours under ideal conditions, without enemy fire. With enemy fire, the timeline doubled or tripled. German defenders had destroyed every permanent bridge. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, captured intact by Americans on March 7th, had collapsed 10 days later, killing 28 engineers and demonstrating the difficulty of maintaining spans under combat conditions. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. The Americans can reach the Rhine. General Alfred Schlemm briefed his 1st Parachute Army staff. They cannot cross it, not against prepared positions. Not without casualties, they cannot afford this late in the war. Every German soldier along the Rhine repeated variations of the same belief. The Western Bank belonged to the Allies, but the Eastern Bank, Germany itself, remained protected by 2,000 years of liquid barrier. Steinberg wrote in his notebook on the evening of March 22nd, "Tomorrow they may try. Tomorrow the Rhine will teach them what every army before them learned. This river does not yield." By sunrise, he would discover that history, doctrine, and nature itself could be rendered obsolete by trucks that swam. March 18th, 1945. 15th Army Headquarters, 5 kilometers east of the Rhine. The sand table in the briefing room showed the Rhine as a blue ribbon cutting through miniature terrain. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel moved wooden blocks representing Allied forces toward the Western Bank while his superior officers watched in silence. "Phase 1, Wenzel announced, sliding assault boat markers onto the water. "Enemy infantry crosses in rubber boats and wooden craft. Vulnerable, slow. Our machine guns and mortars engage at maximum rate during this phase." He paused, letting the officers visualize the killing zone. Phase 2. Small bridgeheads established. Enemy combat engineers begin constructing pontoon bridges under fire. This requires 12 to 18 hours minimum. Our 88mm guns have pre-registered every viable crossing point. Bridges become priority targets. General Major Hans von Obstfelder, commanding LXX Corps, leaned forward. "And if they establish multiple crossings simultaneously?" "Our mobile reserves concentrate on the most threatening bridgehead," Wenzel replied. "Standard doctrine. The bridges are the choke point. Destroy the bridges, and forces on the Eastern Bank are isolated, unsupplied, vulnerable to counterattack." The logic was airtight. Every German officer in the room had studied river crossings: the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga, the Seine. The pattern never changed. Attackers needed bridges to move armor, artillery, supplies, and reinforcements. Bridges required time to construct. Time created vulnerability. Wehrmacht Field Manual 4873. River crossing operations was explicit. Successful defense of major water obstacles depends on disrupting enemy bridging operations during the critical 48 to 72-hour window when bridge construction is most vulnerable. Along the Rhine, German artillery crews had spent months preparing for this window. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann commanded an 88-meter flak battery positioned on high ground overlooking a bend in the river near Ries. His 4 guns could cover a 3-kilometer stretch of riverbank. Each gun had ammunition stockpiled for sustained fire, armor-piercing rounds for bridges, high explosive for infantry concentrations. "They'll use smoke," Hartmann briefed his gun crews on March 20th. "They'll use artillery to suppress us, but eventually they must build bridges, and when we see those bridges, we destroy them." His gunners had practiced on mock targets, floating platforms anchored in calm water behind German lines. They could put 3 rounds into a target the size of a pontoon bridge section at 2,000 meters. Under combat conditions, with Allied counter-battery fire and smoke obscuring vision, hit rates would drop. But they didn't need perfection. They just needed to damage bridge sections faster than engineers could repair them. "One broken span stops the entire bridge," Hartmann reminded his crews. "One destroyed section forces them to start over." Across the Rhine defensive line, similar preparations continued. Artillery observers identified likely crossing points based on terrain, road networks, and tactical advantage. Every promising beach, every gentle slope suitable for bridging equipment, received map coordinates and range calculations. Oberst Werner Kolb, artillery commander for 84th Infantry Division, stood in his observation bunker studying the Western Bank through a trench periscope. "They have the men," They have the guns, but they don't have magic. They must obey the same laws of engineering we do. His operations officer nodded. 48 hours minimum, 72 more likely under fire. 3 days, Kolb said quietly. 3 days when they're most vulnerable. 3 days to make them pay for every meter. No one believed Germany could win the war anymore. Soviet armies pressed from the east. Anglo-American forces controlled the west. The Reich was dying. But the Rhine offered one last opportunity for meaningful resistance. Feldwebel Otto Kraus expressed what many defenders felt. Writing to his wife on March 21st, "We cannot stop them forever, but we can make them remember the Rhine. We can make them count the cost. Perhaps that's worth something." In bunkers, observation posts, and artillery positions along the eastern bank, German defenders waited with quiet, grim confidence. They had studied the terrain. They had registered their guns. They understood the mathematics of river warfare. The Americans would need bridges, and when those bridges appeared, German gunners would be ready. What none of them imagined was that the bridges would never come. April 1942, Provincetown, Massachusetts. The Coast Guard patrol boat PC-1264 sat grounded on a sandbar 200 meters offshore, waves breaking over its hull. Conventional rescue vehicles couldn't reach it, trucks bogged down in beach sand, boats couldn't navigate the shallow surf zone. The crew waited, cold and embarrassed, while Coast Guard officers watched from shore and confronted an operational gap nobody had thought to solve. Palmer Coslet Putnam watched the stranded boat and saw something different. A design problem with strategic implications. Putnam worked for the National Defense Research Committee, and his mind operated in systems and solutions. If America was going to win a global war, it would need to move supplies from ships to beaches across every contested coastline from North Africa to the Pacific. Conventional methods, offloading to smaller boats, then shuttling to shore, were slow, weather-dependent, and vulnerable. What the military needed was a vehicle that could drive on roads like a truck, swim through water like a boat, and transition between both without stopping. Putnam contacted Roderick Stevens, Jr., a yacht designer whose firm, Sparkman and Stevens, had designed some of the fastest racing boats in America. Stevens brought naval architecture expertise. Dennis Pulston, a British-born engineer and sailor, contributed practical knowledge of small craft behavior in rough water. Together, they sketched something unprecedented, a boat-hulled truck. Putnam approached Ford Motor Company first. Ford engineers studied the concept and declined. Impossible in the time frame required, their assessment concluded. The engineering challenges were too complex, the amphibious requirements too demanding, the production timeline too compressed. General Motors Corporation said yes. On April 23, 1942, GMC accepted the project. Engineers at the Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, cleared their schedules and went to work. The clock was running. The design requirements were brutally simple. The vehicle must drive like a standard truck on highways and rough terrain. It must swim fully loaded through ocean surf and river currents. It must fit through existing factory production lines designed for automobiles. And it must be simple enough that civilian workers could build thousands of them without specialized training. GMC's solution was elegant pragmatism. Start with the proven GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck chassis. Already in mass production, already tested, already trusted. Wrap it in a watertight steel hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens using yacht-building principles. Add a propeller driven through the truck's transfer case. Connect a rudder to the steering wheel. Install a system allowing drivers to adjust tire pressure on the move for different terrain. No exotic materials, no custom components that would bottleneck production. Just existing truck parts, naval architecture, and engineering creativity. 38 days later, On June 2, 1942, the first prototype rolled out of the Pontiac factory. The designation came from GMC's internal nomenclature system, as mundane as the engineering was brilliant. D for 1942 design year, U for utility amphibian, K for all-wheel drive, W for dual rear axles. DUKW, pronounced duck by troops who would soon drive them into combat. Major General Jacob Devers observed the demonstration in June 1942. The DUKW drove into water, transitioned to swimming mode, navigated waves, then drove up a beach ramp without stopping. Devers immediately authorized production. The initial contract specified 2,000 vehicles. Within weeks, that number tripled as planners grasped the implications. An amphibious truck could revolutionize supply operations in every theater: Pacific Islands, Mediterranean landings, river crossings in Europe. GMC retooled production lines. Workers who had built Buicks and Pontiacs learned to weld watertight hulls and install marine propellers. By early 1943, DUKWs rolled off assembly lines at rates exceeding 500 per month. Each DUKW cost $10,750, roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, but capabilities exceeded any cost-benefit analysis. The vehicle could carry 2.5 tons of cargo or 25 equipped troops through 4-foot waves, then drive that cargo 70 kilometers inland on highways. By war's end, GMC would manufacture 21,147 DUKWs. British forces received 2,000 through Lend-Lease. Canadian units operated 800 more with cold weather modifications. Frank Speer, GMC's chief engineer on the project, later reflected on the speed. From concept to prototype in 38 days, from prototype to mass production in 6 months. We weren't inventing new technology. We were combining existing solutions in new ways. That's what let us move fast. In April 1942, a stranded Coast Guard boat created a problem. By March 1945, Detroit had built an answer that would help crack open Fortress Europe. German intelligence would observe thousands of DUKWs at Normandy, in Italy, across the Mediterranean, and never imagine they were looking at the vehicle that would turn the Rhine into a highway. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. Through his trench periscope, Obergefreiter Hans Meyer watched strange vehicles emerge from the surf. They looked like boats with wheels, ungainly, slow, and obviously American. They wallowed through waves, churned up the beach, and disappeared inland carrying supplies. Meyer's combat report, filed with 352nd Infantry Division headquarters 3 days later, described them as Amphibious Lastwagen, specialized beach landing vehicles for ship-to-shore logistics. The assessment was accurate, and catastrophically incomplete. At Normandy, DUKWs performed exactly as designed for amphibious assault. They shuttled between transport ships and beaches, carrying ammunition, rations, fuel, and medical supplies. They eliminated the bottleneck of offloading cargo to smaller boats, then transferring again to trucks on shore. A DUKW simply drove off a ship's ramp, swam to the beach, and continued inland without stopping. German intelligence officers collected reports from multiple defensive positions. DUKWs appeared at Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Hundreds of them, all performing the same function: beach logistics. Wehrmacht analysis filed them accordingly. Amphibious supply vehicles. High unit count suggests American logistical excess. Tactical relevance, minimal. Strategic threat, none. The file was closed. Attention shifted to tanks, artillery, and infantry tactics that actually threatened German defensive positions. No one asked the obvious question: if Americans could build trucks that swam through ocean surf, what stopped them from swimming those trucks across rivers? September 1944. Volturno River, Italy. Captain James Mitchell commanded a DUKW company supporting Fifth Army operations in mountainous Italian terrain. Conventional bridging equipment struggled with steep riverbanks and swift currents. Engineers estimated 3 days to construct a pontoon bridge under harassing fire. Mitchell proposed an alternative. "We can cross tonight." His DUKWs ferried an entire infantry battalion across the Volturno in darkness, landing troops on the far bank before German forces could reinforce defensive positions. By morning, American infantry held high ground overlooking the river. German counterattacks found the bridgehead already consolidated. The operation appeared in after-action reports as a tactical innovation, using amphibious vehicles to bypass difficult bridging operations, but it remained small-scale. 1 company, 1 river, 1 night. Allied logistics officers, however, began connecting different data points. At Anzio, DUKWs had crossed the Tiber. In southern France, they'd navigated the Rhine. Across the Po Valley, they'd ferried supplies over irrigation canals and flood-swollen rivers without waiting for engineers. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding multiple DUKW companies in the European theatre, attended a logistics conference in Paris in December 1944. The topic was Rhine crossing preparations. "We're stockpiling bridging equipment," a Corps engineer briefed. "Pontoon sections, steel spans, anchoring gear. We'll need weeks of preparation before we can cross in strength." Thompson raised his hand. "What if we didn't need bridges?" The room went quiet. "DUKWs can cross rivers," Thompson continued. "Not just small rivers, big rivers. We've done it in Italy. We can do it at the Rhine." The implications rippled through planning staffs. If amphibious trucks could cross the Rhine loaded with infantry and supplies, the entire timeline of river crossing operations changed. No vulnerable bridging phase, no predictable concentration points, no 48-hour window for German artillery. The offensive could begin the moment DUKWs entered the water. By January 1945, Allied logistics commands quietly began concentrating DUKWs in forward areas. Units trained on the Maas River, practicing night crossings in fast current. Drivers learned to calculate drift angles, adjust for cargo weight, and navigate by minimal lighting. Major General William Simpson, commanding 9th Army, reviewed DUKW capabilities and revised his Rhine crossing plan entirely. "We're not going to fight for bridgeheads and wait for engineers," he told his staff. "We're going to drive across." British planners integrated American DUKW companies with their own amphibious assets, LVT-4 Buffalo tractors and specialized assault boats. Canadian forces brought their cold-weather-modified DUKWs. Together, they represented over 4,000 amphibious vehicles concentrated along a 100-kilometer front. German intelligence observed the build-up. Aerial reconnaissance photographed vehicle parks behind Allied lines. But analysts saw what they expected to see: supply trucks waiting to cross bridges that would eventually be built. No one imagined the trucks themselves were the assault force. In captured documents after the war, German officers would express bewilderment at their failure. "We saw the vehicles at Normandy," one intelligence summary noted. "We knew they could swim, but we never conceived they would be used operationally to force a major river." It was, as one American logistics officer observed, an imagination failure disguised as an intelligence failure. By March 1945, the stage was set. Thousands of DUKWs waited in concealment. German defenders scanned the Rhine for bridges that would never appear. March 23, 1945, 1700 hours. Western bank of the Rhine. The fire order went out simultaneously to 4,000 guns. From the North Sea to Karlsruhe, Allied artillery positions erupted. British 25-pounders. American 105mm and 155mm howitzers, heavy 8-inch guns, massive 240mm Black Dragons that fired shells weighing 360 pounds. Every tube that could range the eastern bank opened fire at once. The sound didn't build gradually. It simply existed, a continuous roar that obliterated individual explosions into one sustained thunder that made the ground vibrate and the air compress. Eastern Bank, German 84th Infantry Division positions. Gefreiter Heinrich Müller had experienced artillery barrages before. The Eastern Front, Normandy, the Ardennes. He thought he understood what concentrated fire meant. He was wrong. The first shells arrived with a sound like freight trains passing overhead, followed by eruptions that turned entire sections of riverbank into fountains of dirt, steel, and shattered concrete. Then came the next wave, and the next. No pause between salvos, no gaps in the fire, just continuous, overlapping detonations that merged into a single apocalyptic roar. Müller pressed himself into the bottom of his bunker and tried to count shells by sound. He reached 500 and stopped. "It's not individual guns," he shouted to his squad leader over the noise. "It's a wall of fire." The eastern bank disappeared into smoke and flame. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed. Roads cratered. Communication trenches caved in. Telephone wires snapped. Radio antennas toppled. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, at 15th Army Headquarters 5 kilometers back from the river, felt the bombardment as continuous vibration through the concrete floor. Reports from forward positions came in fragmentary, desperate, confused. Under heavy fire. All sectors. Communication to forward observers lost. Cannot observe river due to smoke. Then nothing. Phone lines dead. Radio nets overwhelmed with static and overlapping distress calls. German artillery attempted counter-battery fire, but Allied guns outnumbered them 10-1. Every time a German battery revealed its position by firing, Allied counter-battery radar tracked the trajectory and directed suppressive fire within minutes. German gun crews found themselves targeted by entire battalions. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers who endured the barrage described a sensation beyond fear, a kind of paralysis where thought became impossible, where the world contracted to the small space of a bunker or foxhole while the universe outside turned into fire and steel. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Steinberg, in his observation post at Wesel, abandoned any attempt at recording observations. The smoke was too thick, the noise too overwhelming. The entire western bank had become a continuous muzzle flash stretching north and south beyond sight, a solid line of flame that pulsed and flickered like a burning horizon. "They're preparing for the crossing!" Feldwebel Otto Krause shouted, barely audible even at arm's length. "This is suppression fire. When it lifts, they'll send boats." Every German soldier along the Rhine believed the same thing. This was the preliminary bombardment. Massive, yes. Overwhelming, certainly, but ultimately predictable. When the fire lifted, Wehrmacht doctrine would apply. Machine guns on the waterline, mortars on the beaches, 80mm guns searching for pontoon bridges. What none of them understood was that the bombardment served a second purpose beyond suppression. Western Bank, 458th Amphibious Truck Company Assembly Area. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson stood next to a DUKW and felt the concussion of outgoing artillery through his chest. The noise was so intense that radios were useless. Orders passed by hand signal and shouted words pressed directly to ears, but the noise was an advantage. Under the acoustic blanket of 4,000 guns, hundreds of DUKW engines started. Drivers revved motors, tested transmissions, engaged propeller drives. The mechanical noise disappeared completely into the artillery thunder. Columns of DUKWs rolled toward the river through the smoke and darkness. German observation posts, blinded by their own barrage and deafened by the continuous explosions, detected nothing. At 20-30 hours, the fire shifted. Artillery batteries elevated their tubes, walking the barrage deeper into German positions. Away from the riverbank, away from the waterline, away from exactly where Wehrmacht doctrine predicted the crossing would occur. At 2100 hours, the first DUKWs reached the water's edge. German defenders, ears ringing and eyes streaming from smoke, strained to see through the darkness and haze. They expected assault boats. They expected engineers. They expected vulnerable concentration points they could engage with pre-registered fire. Instead, trucks drove into the Rhine and kept going. The crossing had begun, and German doctrine had nothing to say about what came next. March 23, 1945. 2100 hours. Western bank of the Rhine, near Wesel. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the 7th Battalion, Black Watch, climbed into the DUKW with 11 other infantrymen. The vehicle rocked slightly as they settled onto bench seats, rifles held vertical, equipment strapped tight. An American driver sat at the wheel, his assistant beside him with a clipboard and flashlight. "Currents running about 4 knots, the driver said, voice calm and methodical. "Water temp is 38 degrees. We're loaded at 7,200 pounds. That puts our freeboard at 18 inches if we stay level." McPherson had expected a boat. This felt like boarding a truck that happened to be parked at the river's edge. "Drift calculation puts us at a 22-degree angle upstream on approach," the assistant driver continued, checking notes. "We'll aim for that church steeple, compensate for push, and land about 60 meters south of the marker light." Mathematics. They were talking about crossing the Rhine like it was a geometry problem. The DUKW's engine revved. McPherson felt the vehicle lurch forward, tracks biting into mud. Then, impossibly, the front end tilted down and they were in the water. The transition was seamless. Wheels touched water, the hull settled, and the propeller engaged with a change in engine pitch. They were swimming. "RPMs at 2,200, the driver reported to someone on a radio net McPherson couldn't hear. "Bilge pumps nominal, steering responsive, we're crossing." Around them in the darkness, dozens of other DUKWs entered the Rhine. Black shapes on black water, visible only as darker shadows against the night. Navigation lights, tiny red pinpricks, visible only from behind, marked each vehicle's stern. The Rhine current hit them immediately. McPherson felt the DUKW slide sideways, the bow angling upstream exactly as the driver had predicted. The vehicle's engine labored steadily, propeller churning water, the whole craft wallowing through the current like a determined bathtub. Artillery fire continued overhead, outgoing Allied shells creating a continuous rumble, punctuated by distant explosions on the eastern bank. Smoke drifted across the water in dense patches, obscuring the far shore. A German flare popped overhead, burning magnesium white and swinging beneath its parachute. McPherson's entire body tensed. They were exposed, visible, vulnerable. Machine gun fire chattered from the eastern bank, tracers arcing over the water. Most rounds passed high. One stitched a line across the surface 30 meters to their left, throwing up small geysers. "Taking fire from 11 o'clock, the driver reported, voice still maddeningly calm. "Continuing approach." The DUKW's 50 caliber machine gun on its ring mount opened up. The gunner, another American soldier, tracking tracers back to their source and returning fire in short, disciplined bursts. The flare died. Darkness returned. The DUKW wallowed onward. McPherson felt the current shift as they approached the eastern bank, eddies and confused water where the main channel met the shallows. The vehicle yawed slightly, the driver correcting with the steering wheel, compensating for forces McPherson couldn't see but only feel through the hull. "Approaching landing," the assistant driver announced. "Depth decreasing, 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. The bow lifted slightly. McPherson heard the propeller cavitate as it broke the surface momentarily, then bite again in deeper water. "Contact!" the driver said. The front wheels touched bottom. McPherson felt the DUKW's entire character change, from swimming craft to driving vehicle in a single instant. The tracks gripped submerged earth. The hull lifted as wheels climbed the river bottom. Water poured off the deck. The driver shifted into low gear. The engine note changed. The DUKW surged forward, climbing the eastern bank, tracks throwing mud, water streaming from the hull like a breaching whale. They were on German soil, still moving, still dry inside except for spray. The vehicle hadn't stopped. "Clear of water," the driver reported, "proceeding to disembarkation point." McPherson stared at the other Scottish infantrymen in the darkness. They'd just crossed the Rhine, Germany's impregnable barrier, in a truck. They hadn't gotten wet. They hadn't transferred to assault boats. They hadn't waited for engineers or bridges. They'd simply driven across. Behind them, more DUKWs emerged from the river, dark shapes climbing the bank, water cascading off their hulls, engines grinding as they drove inland. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. The driver pulled into a tree line and stopped. "End of the line, gentlemen. Welcome to Germany." McPherson and his squad dismounted, weapons ready, and faded into the darkness. The DUKW's engine idled for a moment, then reversed course, back down the bank, back into the water, back across the Rhine for another load. The first wave was ashore. And German defenders scanning the darkness for pontoon bridges would find only tire tracks leading up from the water and American infantry already behind their positions. March 24th, 1945. 0230 hours. German defensive positions east of the Rhine. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Steinberg heard the firefight before he understood what it meant. Small arms fire, rifle shots and machine gun bursts coming from behind his observation post, east of the Rhine, on the German side. That was impossible. He scrambled to his radio. "Command, this is Observation Post 7. I have contact reports from our rear. Enemy infantry. Confirmed." The radio operator interrupted, voice tight with confusion. "Multiple positions reporting enemy forces inland from the river." "How did they cross?" Steinberg pressed his binoculars to his face and scanned the Rhine's surface. Dawn light was beginning to grey the eastern sky. The river lay visible through thinning smoke, dark water, empty of boats, empty of pontoon bridge sections, empty of any visible crossing operation. "I see no bridges," Steinberg reported. "No bridging equipment, no boats on the water." "Then where are they coming from?" 3 kilometers south, Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann's 88mm battery had trained their guns on the river since before midnight, waiting for the pontoon bridges Wehrmacht doctrine promised would appear. His gun crews had maintained watch in shifts, eyes straining through smoke and darkness for the telltale shapes of bridge sections being maneuvered into position. They saw nothing. At 0245 hours, Hartmann received orders to reposition. "Enemy armor reported 2 kilometers east of your position. Engage immediately." "East?" Hartmann stared at the map. "They can't have armor east of us. There are no bridges." "Confirmed reports. M10 tank destroyers and anti-tank guns in fighting positions. Move now." Hartmann's guns limbered up and displaced, searching for targets that shouldn't exist. His mind raced through the tactical problem. Armor required bridges to cross. Engineers needed hours to build bridges. His battery had watched the river all night and seen no bridge construction. The mathematics didn't work. 15th Army Headquarters, 0340 hours. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel studied incoming reports with growing incomprehension. Unit after unit reported enemy forces appearing at locations German doctrine said were impossible. A British infantry company had established a defensive position 4 kilometers inland, no bridge visible behind them. American anti-tank guns engaged a German counterattack from positions 3 kilometers from the river, arrival time suggesting they'd crossed hours ago. Canadian troops held a crossroads that Wenzel's own maps showed as rear area supply route, deep behind what should have been the waterline defensive zone. "Where are the bridges?" General Major Hans von Obstfelder demanded, staring at the map where red enemy markers multiplied like infection. "Show me where they're crossing." Wenzel couldn't. Aerial reconnaissance at first light reported no major bridge construction anywhere along the front. Patrol boats sent downriver found no pontoon sections, no assault boats, no engineering operations. Yet Allied forces continued appearing on the eastern bank. The pattern made no sense until a forward observer near Rhine filed a report that Wenzel initially dismissed as combat stress or misidentification. "Observed trucks emerging from the Rhine. Repeat, vehicles driving out of the water onto the eastern bank." 20 minutes later, a second report from a different sector. Large wheeled vehicles, boat-shaped, transitioning from water to land, carrying troops and equipment. Then a third. Amphibious trucks crossing at multiple points. They drive into the river on the western bank and drive out on our side. Wenzel felt understanding arrive like physical cold. The Schwimmwagen. The swimming trucks dismissed as beach equipment. They weren't supporting a crossing. They were the crossing. He found the earlier intelligence assessments, his own reports from months prior. Estimated 50 to 100 vehicles, coastal operations only, not relevant to river warfare. "Get me aerial reconnaissance of the western bank," Wenzel ordered. "I need to know how many of these vehicles they have." The reconnaissance photos arrived at 0800 hours. Analysts counted over 300 DUKWs visible in staging areas within 5 kilometers of the Rhine. Vehicle parks showed hundreds more. The estimates climbed. 500, 700, perhaps over 1,000 amphibious trucks, concentrated for Rhine crossing operations. Not 50, not 100, over 1,000. German artillery commanders frantically repositioned guns, searching for crossing points to interdict. But there were no crossing points. DUKWs entered the Rhine at dozens of locations simultaneously, choosing weak points in German defenses, bypassing strong positions, landing wherever the eastern bank offered decent exit terrain. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed attackers would concentrate at a few viable crossing sites. Defenders could mass fires on those sites. But when attackers could cross anywhere, concentration became impossible. Oberst Werner Kolb, commanding 84th Division Artillery, stared at his map in the grey dawn light. Red marks indicated reported DUKW crossings. They covered the entire divisional front. "We can't cover everywhere," his operations officer said quietly. "No," Kolb agreed. "We can't." By 0900 hours, Allied forces had established bridgeheads at over 40 separate points along a 60-kilometer front. Some positions held only a platoon. Others had company-strength forces with anti-tank guns and mortars, all delivered directly by DUKW without waiting for bridges. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine had no answer. The sacred river had become a highway, and German forces found themselves fighting in all directions at once against an enemy that had crossed without bridges, without predictable timing, without vulnerability. The Rhine had fallen, not to overwhelming force, but to trucks that swam. March 24th, 1945, 1,000 hours. Airspace east of the Rhine. The sky turned black with aircraft. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Steinberg, who had watched the Rhine all night expecting bridges that never came, now stared upward at a sight that defied comprehension. Over 1,700 transport planes and gliders stretched across the horizon. C-46 Commandos, C-47 Skytrains, massive Handley Page Halifaxes towing Horsa gliders. The formation seemed endless, the drone of engines a physical pressure against the earth. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. At 1,000 hours precisely, paratroopers began jumping. American 17th Airborne Division, British 6th Airborne Division, 16,000 troops descending under parachute canopies that filled the sky like wind-blown seeds. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Flak bursts dotted the sky. Some transports trailing smoke. Gliders cut loose from tow planes and descended in steep glides toward landing zones east of Wesel. The air battle was immediate, chaotic, and overwhelming. Every German unit within 10 kilometers pivoted to face the airborne threat. Reserve companies rushed toward drop zones. Artillery batteries shifted fire to engage paratroopers before they could consolidate. Panzers and assault guns rumbled toward reported landing sites. Exactly as Allied planners intended. Rhine riverbank, 10:45 hours. While German forces concentrated on the airborne assault, DUKWs continued crossing the Rhine in an unending stream. But now they carried different cargo. M5 Stuart light tanks rolled off LST landing ships on the western bank, drove directly into DUKWs specially modified with reinforced decks, and crossed the Rhine submerged to their turrets. On the eastern bank, they drove off, shook water from their hulls, and moved inland. 105mm howitzers, normally requiring elaborate bridging to cross rivers, arrived aboard heavy-duty DUKWs that handled the weight through careful load distribution and ballast calculation. Artillery crews followed in subsequent waves. Guns that should have required days to cross were firing from German soil within hours. Ammunition trucks transitioned seamlessly from road to road again, maintaining supply chains without the bottleneck of bridge crossings. Fuel trucks followed. Radio equipment, medical supplies, field kitchens. Everything an advancing army needed flowed across the Rhine on wheels and propellers. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson stood on the eastern bank and watched his DUKW companies execute the operation they'd rehearsed for months. "We're not waiting for bridges," he said to a British liaison officer. "We're not pausing for engineering preparations, we're just crossing, continuously." The British officer watched a DUKW emerge from the river carrying a 6-pounder anti-tank gun and crew. "The Rhine has stopped armies for 2,000 years. You've turned it into a supply route in 12 hours. By noon, the synergy between airborne and amphibious operations became devastatingly clear. German forces rushing to contain airborne drop zones found themselves engaged by Allied armor and artillery that had crossed the Rhine behind them. Units attempting to counterattack river-crossing sites came under fire from paratroopers in their rear areas. Major Hans-Georg Model, Field Marshal Model's son, recorded the confusion in his diary. "We face attack from the sky and from across the river simultaneously. Our reserves move to engage airborne forces and discover enemy armor already across the Rhine in strength. Movement in any direction brings us under fire. The coordination is beyond anything we've faced." The airborne assault, massive and attention-grabbing, served as the hammer. The continuous DUKW crossings, quiet and relentless, served as the anvil. German forces caught between both found no respite. 1600 hours. German 84th Infantry Division Command Post. Oberst Werner Kolb studied casualty reports and understood the operation's brutal elegance. His division had committed reserves to fight paratroopers. While engaged, Allied forces crossing via DUKW had bypassed his strong points, infiltrated his rear areas, and cut his supply routes. "We're fighting in a circle," his operations officer reported. "Enemy forces are now on all sides of our positions." Traditional river-crossing doctrine assumed a pause, a period where defenders could counterattack before bridgeheads consolidated, but there was no pause. DUKWs crossed continuously, bringing reinforcements, supplies, and heavy weapons without interruption. The Rhine had ceased functioning as a defensive barrier. It had become what American logistics planners designed it to be, a staging area, a place where vehicles simply slowed from highway speed to swimming speed, then accelerated again on the far side. By evening of March 24th, over 30,000 Allied troops had crossed the Rhine. Not a single permanent bridge had been completed. German artillery had destroyed exactly 0 bridge sites, because none existed. General Major Hans von Obstfelder, commanding LXXXF Corps, sent a message to Army Group headquarters that captured the doctrinal collapse. Enemy crosses at will with armor and artillery support. Our defensive preparations prove irrelevant. The Rhine no longer functions as an obstacle. Request immediate withdrawal authorization. The request was denied, but the truth was undeniable. The river that had protected Germany for millennia had been defeated by industrial creativity and trucks that swam. March 25, 1945, eastern bank of the Rhine. At 0600 hours, a DUKW emerged from the Rhine carrying something that should have been impossible. Hot breakfast. Private James Morrison of the 51st Highland Division, who'd crossed the night before and spent 18 hours in combat, accepted a metal tray containing scrambled eggs, bacon, bread, and coffee. The food was hot. Steam rose in the cold morning air. "Field kitchen crossed 2 hours ago," the mess sergeant explained, serving from the back of a DUKW that still dripped river water. "We set up, cooked, and now we're feeding the line, same as if we had a bridge." Except there was no bridge. Morrison ate mechanically, too exhausted to appreciate the significance. But the significance was absolute. Allied logistics had crossed a major river without stopping. The arithmetic of amphibious supply. Each DUKW could carry 2.5 tons or 25 troops. Running continuous shuttles, a single vehicle could move 5 tons per hour across the Rhine, comparable to truck traffic across a pontoon bridge, but without the bridge's vulnerability. A 50-vehicle DUKW company could transport 250 tons daily. 20 companies, 1,000 DUKWs, moved 5,000 tons across the Rhine every 24 hours. Ammunition, fuel, rations, equipment, and personnel flowed in an unbroken stream that German artillery couldn't interdict because there was no fixed target to hit. Captain Thomas Reed, a logistics officer with 30 Corps, tracked the flow with professional appreciation. "We're sustaining an entire army group across a major water obstacle without engineer support. That's never been done before." What the DUKWs carried. Artillery ammunition dominated early crossings. 105mm shells for field artillery, each round weighing 33 pounds, packed in wooden crates. DUKWs delivered them directly to gun positions inland, eliminating the usual transfer from supply dumps to forward areas. Batteries maintained fire rates that should have been impossible without established supply lines. 155mm howitzer ammunition followed, 95-pound shells that required careful loading to maintain DUKW stability in water. Fire support never slackened. Mortar teams received continuous ammunition resupply. 81mm mortar rounds arrived in cases of 6. Crews that expected to ration ammunition found themselves with surplus. German counterattacks met walls of high explosive fire. Fuel drums kept Allied armor moving. Each DUKW carried 24 5-gallon jerry cans, 120 gallons per trip. Tank companies that should have been immobilized waiting for bridged fuel trucks maintained operational tempo. Sherman tanks and Cromwells ranged deeper into German territory than Wehrmacht planners thought possible. Radio batteries, signal wire, and communications equipment crossed continuously. Forward observers maintained contact with artillery. Infantry companies coordinated maneuvers. The command and control network functioned as if operating from established bases rather than from bridgeheads carved out hours earlier. Medical supplies arrived in waterproof crates. Plasma, bandages, morphine, sulfur powder, and surgical instruments. Battalion aid stations operated at full capacity. Wounded soldiers received treatment comparable to rear area facilities. Then came the wounded themselves. DUKWs returning empty from supply runs loaded casualties. The vehicle's boat-hulled design provided smooth water crossing, gentler than bouncing across temporary bridges. Medics accompanied critical cases, administering aid during the crossing. Wounded soldiers reached field hospitals on the Western Bank within an hour of injury. Private William Hughes, shot through the shoulder at 0900, was in surgery at a field hospital by 10:30. "They put me in a truck," he recalled later. "The truck drove into the river. I thought I was delirious. Then we drove out on the other side and kept going. I was in hospital before I understood what happened." Luftwaffe searches for targets. German bomber formations appeared over the Rhine on the night of March 25th, Ju-88s and He-111s searching for the bridges that Allied intelligence indicated should exist. Pilots scanned the river with bomb sights, looking for pontoon bridge sections illuminated by moonlight. They found nothing. Bomb loads intended for bridges fell on empty river or random targets. Some crews reported seeing vehicles in the water but dismissed them as reconnaissance boats or minor crossing craft. Nothing worth wasting bombs on. Post-mission reports filed with Luftwaffe Command expressed confusion. Allied forces clearly established on Eastern Bank in division strength. No bridges observed. Unknown how forces crossed or how they maintained supply. German intelligence analysts revised estimates upward again. Perhaps 2,000 DUKWs, perhaps 3,000. The numbers seemed absurd, but the evidence was undeniable. Allied armies operated east of the Rhine with supply chains functioning at near normal efficiency, despite the absence of bridges. By March 26th, combat engineers finally completed the first pontoon bridge across the Rhine, Class 40, capable of supporting tanks. It was a magnificent achievement of military engineering, anchored against swift current, proof against German artillery that had been suppressed or destroyed. But the bridge was almost superfluous. By the time it opened, over 50,000 troops had crossed via DUKW, along with hundreds of vehicles, dozens of artillery pieces, and thousands of tons of supplies. The Rhine had been defeated not by bridging it, but by ignoring the need for bridges entirely. American industrial ingenuity had solved a 2,000-year-old military problem with trucks, propellers, and mass production. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, captured 3 days later, said it simply, "You crossed a river with trucks. We prepared for a battle. You delivered supplies." March 26, 1945, German 84th Infantry Division Headquarters. Oberst Werner Kolb laid his pencil down on the operations map and admitted what he'd known since dawn. His division no longer controlled any coherent defensive line. Red marks indicating Allied positions now appeared behind, beside, and in some cases, beyond his own unit locations. Blue marks showing German forces had become isolated pockets rather than a continuous front. The map looked less like a military situation and more like a disease spreading through tissue. "Where did their armor come from?" his operations officer asked, pointing to reported Sherman tank positions 5 kilometers inland. "We've had observers on the Rhine for 3 days. No bridges, no ferries. How are they moving tanks across?" Kolb had no answer. German doctrine provided no framework for understanding what was happening. Diary of Major Hans-Georg Model, captured April 1945. March 25th. Ordered to counterattack enemy positions near Hammenkeln. Intelligence indicated 1 infantry battalion. Minimal support. We advanced with 2 companies and 3 assault guns. Found entire American battalion dug in with anti-tank guns, mortars, and artillery support. They had been across the Rhine less than 24 hours. How did they fortify so quickly? Counterattack failed. Lost one assault gun to concealed M10 tank destroyer. Withdrew under heavy mortar fire. The Americans had more ammunition than we did, and we were attacking from our own supply bases. March 26th. New orders. Contain airborne forces at Wesel. Moved at dawn. Encountered British armor advancing from the south, behind our positions. How did tanks cross the Rhine? Still no bridges visible. Artillery observer reports trucks emerging from river carrying guns and supplies. I thought he was suffering combat stress. Now I believe him. The Americans have solved river crossing. We prepared for bridges. They sent trucks that swim. If this is true, if they can simply drive across major rivers, then defensive warfare as we know it is finished. 84th Infantry Division Intelligence Summary, March 27th. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel compiled reports from surviving forward units. The pattern was undeniable. Allied forces appeared at unexpected locations with full equipment loads. Counterattacks encountered prepared defensive positions where German maps showed only river crossings. Supply rates indicated Allied units operated at full logistical capacity, despite the absence of bridge infrastructure. Wenzel's assessment, written in the careful language of military analysis, concealed desperation. Enemy amphibious vehicles numbering in the thousands have eliminated the Rhine as an operational obstacle. Current defensive preparations based on bridge interdiction doctrine are obsolete. Recommend immediate strategic withdrawal to defensible terrain east of the Rhine Valley. The recommendation was filed. No withdrawal authorization came. Personal letter, Feldwebel Otto Kraus to his wife, March 27th. Never sent. Liebling, I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't know if I will reach you. But I need to write what I have seen, because it changes everything I thought I understood about this war. The Americans have crossed the Rhine. Not with bridges, not with boats, with trucks that swim. I know how this sounds. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't watched them emerge from the water. Huge boat-shaped vehicles driving up the bank as if the Rhine were merely a road with deeper mud. We prepared for weeks. We registered every crossing point. We had plans for every contingency, but we never imagined this. How do you defend against an enemy who can cross your greatest river at any point they choose? Today we tried to counterattack a British position. We thought we outnumbered them, but they had anti-tank guns, mortars, ammunition reserves, everything they needed delivered directly from across the Rhine without bridges. We lost 23 men. We gained nothing. The older soldiers talk about Russia, about how Russian numbers overwhelmed us. But this is different. This isn't numbers. This is thinking. The Americans thought about the problem differently than we did. They built trucks that swim, and now the Rhine, our sacred river, means nothing. If they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is finished. I don't say this as defeat or cowardice. I say it as recognition. We prepared for the wrong war. The letter was found on Kraus's body 3 days later. He died in a rearguard action covering his unit's withdrawal from positions that no longer had meaning. Army Group B Headquarters, March 28th. Field Marshal Walter Model reviewed casualty reports and understood the strategic reality his field commanders already knew. The Rhine defense had collapsed not through overwhelming force but through obsolescence. German doctrine assumed rivers created operational pauses, time for defenders to regroup, counterattack, and extract concessions. But there was no pause. Allied forces flowed across the Rhine continuously, building combat power faster than German reserves could respond. Model's Chief of Staff, Generalleutnant Karl Wagner, summarized with characteristic bluntness, "They've turned the Rhine into a highway. Our artillery searches for bridges to destroy. There are no bridges. Our doctrine is irrelevant." Model nodded slowly. "We prepared for Sedan, for the Meuse, for every river crossing in military history. We did not prepare for this. The emotional shift spread through German units east of the Rhine, from stubborn resistance to something quieter and more final. Not panic, not rout, but recognition. The Americans had rewritten the rules of river warfare, and Germany had no answer. March 25, 1945. Eastern bank of the Rhine, near Wesel. Winston Churchill stood on German soil and watched history being rewritten in real time. The Prime Minister had insisted on crossing, against the protests of his security detail, against the advice of field commanders who warned that German artillery still ranged the area, against every reasonable argument for keeping the British head of government away from active combat zones. Churchill didn't care. The Rhine had been crossed. He would stand on the eastern bank. General Bernard Montgomery, whose 21st Army Group had executed the operation, accompanied Churchill across in an assault boat, one of the conventional craft used alongside the DUKWs. The crossing took 12 minutes. Churchill sat in the bow, cigar clenched in his teeth, utterly unmoved by occasional shell splashes in the water. On the eastern bank, he planted his walking stick in German earth and surveyed the river he'd studied for 5 years of war. What he saw defied centuries of European military tradition. DUKWs emerged from the Rhine in continuous procession, dark, ungainly vehicles rising from the water like something from prehistory, dripping, mechanical, unstoppable. They climbed the bank with engines roaring, then rolled inland carrying troops, supplies, and equipment. No pause, no ceremony, just industrial process applied to military conquest. "Look at them," Churchill said to Montgomery, gesturing with his cigar. "Beasts crawling out of the river." It wasn't criticism. It was awe. Montgomery, who understood Churchill's classical education and love of historical metaphor, recognized what the Prime Minister was seeing. This wasn't Caesar's legions building timber bridges. This wasn't Napoleon's Grande Armée forcing a river through tactical brilliance. This wasn't even the traditional British imperial method of overwhelming firepower and methodical engineering. This was something new, American, industrial. Churchill watched another DUKW emerge, this one carrying a 105mm howitzer. The vehicle drove up the bank, water streaming from its hull, and disappeared into a tree line where British troops were consolidating positions. Minutes later, he heard the howitzer fire its first rounds. "They've built trucks that swim," Churchill mused. "Not as an engineering curiosity, not as a specialized vehicle for unique circumstances, but as mass-produced industrial equipment. Thousands of them." Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, stood beside Churchill and understood the moment's weight. Britain had won its empire through naval dominance and industrial revolution, being first to apply factory production to military power. But that era was ending. "The Americans build differently than we do," Brooke observed. "They don't refine, they multiply. They don't perfect, they produce." Churchill nodded slowly, watching another DUKW climb from the river. "We British built the finest ships. The Germans built the finest tanks. The Americans built enough trucks to cross the Rhine." The statement captured something profound about the war's trajectory. European powers, British, German, French, Russian, had approached warfare as an extension of national culture, precision engineering, military tradition, tactical excellence, historic rivalry. America approached warfare as a logistics problem. If trucks couldn't cross rivers, build trucks that could. If you needed thousands, build tens of thousands. If doctrine said river crossings required bridges, eliminate the need for bridges entirely. Churchill's party included British officers who'd fought since 1939, men who remembered Dunkirk, who'd held North Africa, who'd survived the Blitz. They stood on the Rhine's eastern bank and watched American industrial capacity physically manifest as military victory. "We couldn't have done this," one British general admitted quietly. "We don't think this way." Montgomery, normally protective of British military reputation, didn't disagree. The Americans saw a problem, major rivers as obstacles, and treated it as an engineering challenge for factories to solve. "We would have designed better assault boats. They built swimming trucks." Churchill remained on the eastern bank for 30 minutes, observing the DUKW traffic. Vehicle after vehicle emerged from the Rhine: ammunition carriers, troop transports, supply trucks, even ambulances evacuating wounded back across the river. No bridges, no vulnerable pontoon sections, no predictable crossing points for artillery, just continuous industrial flow turning Germany's greatest natural barrier into a highway. Before departing, Churchill insisted on urinating in the Rhine, a gesture reported widely and interpreted as defiant symbolism. But his private comments to Brooke revealed deeper thoughts. "This river stopped Rome," Churchill said. "It stopped Napoleon. It stopped us in 1918 until Germany collapsed from within, and the Americans crossed it with trucks." He paused, watching another DUKW emerge. "The old order, European empires, continental warfare, classical military tradition. It's ending. We're watching it end. Those beasts crawling from the river, that's the future. Industrial, American, inevitable." Montgomery offered Churchill his boat for the return crossing. Churchill shook his head. "I'll take one of those," he said, pointing to a DUKW. He rode back across the Rhine in an American amphibious truck, sitting among British troops, crossing the river that had defined European history for 2 millennia, now reduced to a traffic obstacle that didn't even require slowing down. The old imperial order returned to the western bank. The new industrial order kept rolling forward. Post-war analysis, 1945 to 1946. The numbers told a story that defied military history. Operation Plunder, the Allied Rhine crossing, put over 80,000 troops on the eastern bank in the first 24 hours. Casualties totaled approximately 3,500 killed and wounded across all units. For a forced crossing of a major river against prepared defenses, the figure was astonishingly low. By comparison, the Soviet crossing of the Dnieper in 1943 cost over 400,000 casualties. The Rapido River crossing in Italy claimed 2,000 American casualties in a single day for minimal gains. Even successful river crossings throughout military history demanded terrible arithmetic: 10%, 15%, sometimes 20% casualties among assault forces. At the Rhine, Allied casualty rates stayed below 5%. The U.S. Army's official history attributed the difference to multiple factors: overwhelming artillery superiority, air supremacy, German force degradation. But buried in logistics annexes was the critical variable. DUKWs eliminated the 48 to 72-hour vulnerability window that made river crossings catastrophic. Traditional doctrine says attackers are most vulnerable during bridging operations, wrote Colonel Trevor Dukw in his post-war analysis. Allied forces never had bridging operations in the conventional sense. They crossed continuously from hour one, building combat power faster than defenders could react. Time saved, lives preserved. Military analysts calculated that without DUKWs, the Rhine crossing would have required an additional 7 to 10 days to establish bridgeheads strong enough to sustain offensive operations eastward. Those days would have cost thousands of additional casualties and allowed German forces to establish defense lines deeper into Germany. Instead, Allied armies maintained momentum. By March 28th, 5 days after first crossing, spearheads had advanced over 60 kilometers beyond the Rhine. Encirclements trapped entire German army groups. The Ruhr industrial region fell. Organized German resistance in the west collapsed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later wrote, "The Rhine crossing succeeded not merely because we crossed, but because we crossed without pause. The enemy never had opportunity to consolidate, counterattack, or establish coherent defense. That continuity was achieved by American amphibious vehicles. German post-war assessments. Allied interrogators questioned German generals extensively about the Rhine defense failure. Their conclusions were remarkably consistent. General Alfred Jodl, Wehrmacht Chief of Operations. We calculated based on historical precedent. River crossings required bridges. Bridges required time to build. Time created vulnerability we could exploit. The Americans eliminated all three assumptions with a vehicle we never properly assessed. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Our intelligence observed DUKWs at Normandy, Sicily, and Italy. We filed them as minor equipment, beach logistics vehicles. This was catastrophic failure of imagination. We saw what we expected to see rather than understanding what we observed. Generalleutnant Günther Blumentritt. German military tradition emphasized tactical excellence and operational art. American military doctrine emphasized logistics and industrial capacity. At the Rhine, logistics defeated tactics. Their trucks crossed our greatest river, and our entire defensive concept became obsolete. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army. The Americans fought differently than European armies. We sought decisive battle. They sought logistical superiority. We built better tanks. They built trucks that swam. When the Rhine fell not to tactical brilliance but to industrial improvisation, we understood the war was lost in factories, not on battlefields. The DUKW's legacy. By war's end, DUKWs had participated in every major Allied amphibious operation. Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, southern France, the Rhine, and countless river crossings across Europe and the Pacific. Over 21,000 vehicles served in every theater, carrying millions of tons of supplies and hundreds of thousands of troops. Post-war, DUKWs remained in military service for decades. They evacuated civilians during floods, supported humanitarian operations, and demonstrated that the line between civilian truck and military assault vehicle was thinner than anyone imagined. But their finest hour remained March 1945, when they transformed a 2,000-year-old barrier into a highway. Final accounting. The Rhine crossing cost the Allies approximately 3,500 casualties and 3 days of intensive combat to establish unassailable positions on the eastern bank. It shortened the war in Europe by an estimated 2 to 3 weeks and prevented the establishment of German defensive lines that might have cost tens of thousands of additional Allied lives. The operation succeeded because American industrial creativity had rendered obsolete every assumption about river warfare that European military tradition held sacred. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, captured March 28th and interrogated about German intelligence failures, summarized it simply in his debriefing. We prepared to defend a river. You prepared to ignore it. We studied history. You built trucks. In the end, Detroit defeated the Rhine more decisively than any army in 2,000 years. The assessment was accurate. The Germans built a fortress out of a river. The Americans sent trucks and turned it into a supply route. Industrial ingenuity had defeated ancient geography. Mass production had overcome military tradition. And a vehicle designed to rescue a stranded Coast Guard boat had helped bring down the Third Reich. The DUKW, ungainly, utilitarian, utterly American, had rewritten the rules of warfare by the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge that rivers were supposed to stop armies. They weren't obstacles. They were just roads that required different tires.